Welcome to the Indiana Jones in History podcast. I'm your host, Justin Jacobs. I've been studying the historical men behind the silver screen legend for over a decade now, and the purpose of this podcast is to share the fruits of what I've learned with you. Now, I wish I could say I've been studying the historical men and women behind the silver screen legend, but unfortunately there were very few women involved in the history of archaeological expeditions in any way, shape, or form. This is not to say that there weren't any, but you do have to search far and wide before they make an appearance, and when you find them, they tend to be dutiful wives who followed their husbands wherever their husbands wanted to go. In short, this is an overwhelmingly dude-centric story. And not just any dudes, but good old-fashioned white Anglo-Saxon Protestant dudes for the most part. But let's try to not let that politically incorrect detail derail what is otherwise an utterly fascinating story of globe-trotting adventure, intrigue, and mystery. Now, the adventure and intrigue should probably be obvious, at least I hope it's obvious, to anyone who has decided that they want to listen to this podcast. But it is the mystery that inspired me to do this podcast and the research that informs these episodes in the first place. What mystery, you say? Well, quite simply, the mystery of what the historical Indiana Jones was all about. Who the hell was he? Why does that belong in a museum? Who made his expeditions possible? That is, who enabled Indiana Jones? And most excitingly, who confronted Indiana Jones? And then, of course, there's the question on everyone's mind, did Hollywood get it right? By the end of what I believe is a very bingeable 5-episode podcast series, you will know the answers to all of these questions. And I can fill you in and give you a little hint on the answer to the final question about Hollywood. No, Hollywood did not get it right, but the story of how they did not get it right, and some fortuitous convergences of things that they did get right, but almost certainly unintentionally, is again utterly fascinating. So, without further ado, let's not waste any more time, and let's get started with our first question. Who was Indiana Jones? Well, that is the easy part. Okay, we have a very clinical definition that we can use to identify the historical Indiana Jones in any time or place. It is as follows. The historical Indiana Jones in history, was anyone who transported artifacts across ethnic and cultural boundaries in the name of science, but in service to an empire. All right, now that's a mouthful. Let's do it again. Indiana Jones in history was anyone who transported artifacts across ethnic and cultural boundaries in the name of science, but in service to an empire. All right, let's break this definition down. Let's begin with the very first element, artifact. Indiana Jones is someone who takes artifacts. Okay, what is an artifact? Well, an artifact is a material object whose natural lifespan has been determined to be over. It has ended. And you're going to take this object, maybe you dug it out of the sand or a cave or wherever you found it. You're going to take this object and you're going to quarantine it in a sterile new environment, put it on display, and give it a new function. Okay, you're going to transform its function. What is that new function? Public education. You're going to put this artifact in a museum. You're going to incubate it, make it sterile, and you're going to say, this 2,000-year-old spoon, its original function was to eat with. All right, now no one is ever going to eat with this spoon again. It is behind a glass wall, temperature controlled, with a little placard in front of it that explains where this came from, how old it is. It has a new function. It's no longer being used for what it was originally intended to be used for when it was in its original social environment 2,000-3,000 years ago, when someone picked up that spoon and ate a bowl of rice with it. Okay? And the new function that this spoon has is public education. Okay? People are supposed to come to this, look at the object, now an artifact, and they're supposed to learn something. Okay? And then indirectly, they're supposed to pay thanks to the rich men who funded the museum and funded the expeditions that made possible the transformation of this object into an artifact. And we have a term for this process of turning an object into an artifact. It's not very imaginative. It's actually lacks creativity completely. It's called the process of artifaction. Okay, the process of artifaction is this process of taking something, an object, a material object, and changing its utility, changing its function from its original social context into a new social context, that of public education. Okay? Now, what does he actually do with this artifact? He transports it across cultural and ethnic boundaries. This is where the adventure comes in. Okay? What is the definition of adventure in the Indiana Jones film series? Well, he has to cross ethnic and cultural boundaries. Okay? Taking something from Germany to Italy is not enough. That's primarily, yes, it's a cultural and ethnic boundary to a certain extent as well, but it's primarily a political boundary. Okay, when Steven Spielberg and George Lucas were first brainstorming Raiders of the Lost Ark in 1978, 3 years before the film came out, you have this line where I believe it's Steven Spielberg says, "We don't want to do one scene in the States, in the United States. Keep them out of the United States at all costs." Okay, the idea is that adventure has to take place in exotic lands. Exotic lands are places where you find ethnic and cultural difference. All right, this is perhaps one of the most crucial factors in trying to define and locate where you find Indiana Jones in history. All right, this criterion gives us the date of 1798 as the beginning of Indiana Jones-like archaeological expeditions. What happens in 1798, you ask? That's the year that the French, under the command of Napoleon, invade Egypt. And he takes along over 100 French scholars, savants, with him to Egypt, and they systematically begin to record and illustrate the monuments of ancient Egypt, and take objects, material objects, and transport them back to France, put them in the Louvre, behind glass with a little placard on it explaining what this is, and they have transformed what were once living objects with an original, probably most likely religious purpose 3,000 years ago, and they've turned it into an artifact with a mission of public education. Okay, so 1798 really we can identify as the beginning of the age of Indiana Jones. That's the first major expedition in which you have artifacts being transported across ethnic and cultural boundaries, specifically in service to an empire and in the name of science. Okay, now, in this series and in my own research, I make an exception to move the date a little bit further back because we have to understand where the museum comes from. Okay, because ultimately, the expedition and the removal of artifacts across these boundaries is justified on the pretext that you're going to put that new artifact into a museum. So where does the museum come from? Well, you have to move a little bit farther back to about 1750, about 50 years before the French invasion of Egypt. And we're going to talk about that in episode 2, why does that belong in a museum? Okay, and so you have to understand a little bit about Pompeii, the precursors to the Louvre, the Luxembourg Gallery, and we're going to get into that later. Okay, and that's okay because the filmmakers themselves break their own rule. They actually have a few scenes in the United States after all, so we can break this rule too and go a little bit before the 1798 invasion of Egypt. Okay, now, if transportation across ethnic and cultural boundaries is not possible, if for whatever reason you can't do that, logistically, ideologically, whatever, then you cannot find Indiana Jones in the historical record. Okay? So you're probably already realizing here, looking at the episodes that we have, in episode 4, we're going to talk about who obstructed Indiana Jones. All right, well, at some point we know that the expeditions stop, and they're no longer possible. That means the era of Indiana Jones is over. My favorite example is to talk about the Terracotta Warriors in China. The army, the army for the afterlife of the first emperor of the Qin dynasty in this 3rd century BC. Okay, terracotta warriors are discovered in the 1970s. I think it's 1974. You could make an argument that it is the most spectacular archaeological discovery in the history of the world. Maybe King Tut is up there as well, but it's pretty fantastic. All right, but the terracotta warriors play absolutely no role whatsoever in the historical Indiana Jones, because by 1974, it was no longer possible for men from Europe or America to travel to culturally and ethnically alien lands, remove objects, and put them into their own museum back home. And so the terracotta warriors were discovered, analyzed, preserved, and put on display entirely by the Chinese from start to finish. Okay? And that's fine. That's great for them. But if you're looking for Indiana Jones, you're not going to find him. Okay? The era of Indiana Jones is over by that point because the terracotta warriors cannot be transported permanently, obviously traveling expeditions. They can't be transported permanently by Westerners from non-Western lands anymore. All right, now let's move to the second half of our clinical definition of who the historical Indiana Jones was. He removes these artifacts, he transports artifacts across cultural and ethnic boundaries in the name of science. Okay, he always has this. This is his chief pretext for why he has the right to remove things. Okay, what is science? Well, it's a moving target and it can often be vague. Okay, and it's usually defined in opposition to what it is not. What is not science? Not science is what the superstitious, dark-skinned peoples, sorry to say it that way, but more often than not, that is exactly how it's portrayed in the historical record. Superstitious, dark-skinned peoples who cower in the face of a golden idol. That might conjure up some uncomfortable images of the opening scene of the very first Indiana Jones Raiders of the Lost Ark after he outruns the oversized boulder and falls down in the jungle. He is confronted by René Belloc, the French archaeologist who is his lifelong rival, and Belloc is surrounded by, scantily clad, dark-skinned natives who are, dressed up to look like savages. Okay, and they're superstitious. And if you actually go back to the original brainstorming session, you see Lucas and Spielberg and Larry Kasdan, the co-writer of the script, talking about this. They discuss the opening scene of Indiana Jones at length. And they talk about how, we're going to establish that Indiana Jones is a man of science. He is a professor. He's an educated Westerner because he doesn't believe in superstition. One of his famous lines, I don't believe in bedtime stories. He's always the skeptic. Okay? And it's the natives who, see gas coming out of a fissure in the rock or a golden idol, and they cower because they're scared of its superstitious powers, and Indiana Jones isn't afraid of that. He's a man of science. He's rational. Okay? So, the Westerners will say, only we practice science. And science involves the preservation and the analysis, the objective, politically disinterested analysis of an object that we have transformed into an artifact for the purpose of public education. All right, and again, you see the museum rear its head into this discussion because the museum validates these scientific claims and says the presence of a museum embodies and confirms the Enlightenment ideals of science, education, and preservation. We'll have a lot more to say about museums later on. Okay, but without museums, it's very difficult for the Westerners, for the Indiana Jones in history, to say that they're removing things in the name of science. Because if they take things and put it into a private collection, keep it for themselves, there's no science involved. You have to have that museum with its public mission of education, where all scholars can come and study it. Okay, and then finally, they do this in the name of science. That's their loud public face. But hidden behind the scenes is the secret. Okay, is the mystery. And the mystery is this, that all adventures, all archaeological expeditions claim to be merely what they appear to be. Science. We are studying the world, analyzing it, and then educating the poor benighted masses about their history. But every single archaeologist, much like Indiana Jones in the film, as we'll have occasion to discuss, every single archaeologist has a hidden, secret agenda, usually political in nature, and that is, they set out to glorify their own empire or their own state as the best version of Western civilization. Okay, they say Western civilization is the best, but within Western civilization, they say our empire is the best. The French are better than the British are better than the Russian, and what have you. And when you go out and you get artifacts and bring them back to your museum, you are showing that your empire and all that it represents is the best practitioner of science that there is, and therefore best suited to lead the world. And all the empires compete with one another. And the archaeologists who work in service to these empires compete with one another, and they want very badly for this artifact to go to their museum and not their rival's museum, even though they're all going to museums in the end. And then on the side, they have some other secrets. Most archaeologists, as we'll talk about later in this episode, engaged in what we would now refer to as espionage. They wouldn't have thought of it in that precisely those terms at the times, but in hindsight, we recognize it's exactly what it was. All right, they were very willing to undertake intelligence work and then share it with their government when they returned home. Okay, now with the parameters of this definition of the historical Indiana Jones defined, we are going to proceed to look at some major themes, 8 of them in all, 8 major themes that recur over and over and over again in the historical record when you're looking for someone who fits the definition of who Indiana Jones in history actually is. Let's begin with race. Okay, Indiana Jones is a white-skinned practitioner of science. Or so he says. Okay? And one of my favorite examples when I illustrate this point is to show a cartoon from the 1937 issue of November 12th, 1937 issue of the Saturday Evening Post in New York. Now, this is a podcast, so I can't show you the cartoon itself, but I can describe it for you. This is 1937, just to give you a preview of our chronology. This is at the end of the age of archaeological expeditions. Okay, most of them have already been obstructed by this point. And the Saturday Evening Post publishes this cartoon by David Huffine, and it takes place on a dock on the Hudson River in New York. You see the Statue of Liberty in the background. And there's several men involved. You have an African-American man casually dressed standing on a dock, and he's talking to a smartly dressed white porter. And down in the water are 2 men in a canoe, 2 men with very dark black skin, and only a loincloth, wearing barely anything. And they're in one of these long canoes, and they're in the Hudson River. And then there's a third of these scantily clad, dark-skinned man on the dock, holding a spear with his nose pierced. All right, clearly these men have come from Africa or, a tribe in the Amazon or something. And the African-American janitor, or whoever he is on the dock, says to the white porter, and they try to recreate the imagined slang of an African-American man in the 1930s, so apologies in advance here, I'm just reading out the caption as it appears in the cartoon. The man says, "He say dey is a expedition, come here to get stuff for dey museum." All right, and of course, this is meant to be funny. It's a cartoon. It's meant to be funny. Now, we don't really find this funny anymore in our own day and time, but the humor at the time would have been obvious to anyone who knew about or participated in or led or funded an archaeological expedition at any point over the previous 150 years. Namely, only white men do expeditions. Expeditions are what white civilized people do in dark, uncivilized lands. And that's why this cartoon is supposed to be funny in 1937, because Western archaeologists have been kicked out of the countries where they have been doing work for so long, and they are now laughing at the idea that non-white people, i.e., tribal men with very little clothes and tattoos and ear piercings all over, the idea that they would come to New York to do an expedition and take stuff away from civilized people and then take it back and put it in some sort of museum back in Africa or the Amazon is absurd. And it's laughable. And many people who saw that cartoon undoubtedly laughed out loud. Okay, so it wasn't always explicitly put in these terms. It's not like the archaeologist Indiana Jones in history made a big fetish about being white. But they were almost all white. Absolutely. Okay, and for the first 100 years or so of Western archaeological expeditions from Napoleon in 1798 until the 1930s, until World War I, about most of the 19th century, this was the historical Indiana Jones by default. All right? The archaeologists and explorers came from pale-skinned Europe. Or if they came from America later, their ancestors had come from Europe. Usually Northern and Western Europe, too. Okay? Towards the end of the 19th century, as we'll have occasion to discuss in episode 4, this is more and more of a Western fantasy. Okay? But there was nearly a century in which it seemed that the only people who went out and tried to collect things and turn them into artifacts and put them in museums back home, they were all white men. And therefore, it proves itself. If only white men do this, then clearly there's something special about white men. And it's absurd to think that anyone different than us, who looks different than us, would actually do this on their own as well. Okay? And what we actually see is the more resistance that the Westerners get from non-Western peoples towards their expeditions and the removal of artifacts, the more you see the propagation, the creation of a Western fantasy, what I would call the consumed Indiana Jones, as opposed to the historical Indiana Jones. And the consumed Indiana Jones is an escapist fantasy in which white men continue to go out and collect things for their museum. And no one else does that. They're the only ones who do that. They are the only men of science. And this is an idea that will be propagated in newspaper accounts of Western expeditions, in comic books, in films. And ironically, the Indiana Jones films are said to begin in 1936. All right, and by 1936, the historical Indiana Jones is pretty much done for. There are no more expeditions, at least not unilateral Western-led expeditions after 1936. And yet that's when this escapist consumer adventure fantasy truly takes root. The moment that Westerners are kicked out of foreign countries and no longer able to transport artifacts across ethnic and cultural boundaries, the fantasy that they were the only ones capable of doing it and will always do it takes hold. Stronger than ever before. Now, let's move on to our second major theme. The ideological background, the education of the historical Indiana Jones. Well, there's two major elements we have to understand. The first is that they had an education that was steeped in the Greek and Roman classics, a Greco-Roman focused education. The second is that they had sympathy for, perhaps not actual belief in, but certainly sympathy for, Judaism and Christianity. Judeo-Christian sympathies and a Greco-Roman education. All right, their education, and they're highly educated, by the way, almost all of them. Many of them have PhDs. Their education was focused on the Hebrew, Greek, and Latin classics. Now, the Greek and Latin classics were often accessed and read in the original, because they would be forced to study Latin and Greek. It'd be embarrassing if you didn't know Latin and Greek for many of these scholars. Now, Hebrew, many of them did not learn Hebrew, so they would access the Hebrew classics, literary classics, namely the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, in translation. Okay, but when you start studying Western archaeological expeditions, you find examples of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew familiarity and sympathies all over the place. When I read through the diaries of the British archaeologist Aurel Stein, you'll be hearing a lot about Aurel Stein in these episodes because he's the guy that I do the bulk of my actual historical research on when I look at Western expeditions. Stein's always including Greek and Latin phrases in the privacy of his diary. He's not publishing this and trying to impress anyone. He just includes these things in his own diary entries, because that's the way that he thinks and writes in terms of Greek and Roman vocabulary. And he peppers his English prose with these words. And I'm reading his diary and I'm like, what the hell does this mean? Because we don't study Latin or Greek, or at least we're not forced to study Latin or Greek anymore in school. And I studied Chinese and Chinese history, so I don't know anything about Latin and Greek words except what I remember from high school Spanish. So all the time, I'm like, all right, I got to go to Google Translate again and try and figure out what this word is. It's probably Latin. Maybe it's Greek, but I got to figure it out because Stein knew it, and I have to understand what he meant when he inserts these little words. Leonard Woolley, a very famous archaeologist who did a lot of work in the Middle East and in modern-day Iraq, I've actually found telegrams in which he is writing his telegram to another archaeologist in Latin. The entire telegram is in Latin. It's a great code, by the way, right? Well, maybe not if everyone who's also educated understands Latin. But nonetheless, that would be seen as something normal for a man like that. I'm going to write a Western Union telegram to tell people back home what I found. Hey, let's write it in Latin, not English. Okay, these men are highly educated and steeped in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew literary canon. Now, what are some of the biases of this ideological backdrop of this? Let's start with the Greco-Roman education. Now, I'll give you several examples. When Giovanni Belzoni, an Italian explorer working on behalf of the British consul in Egypt, when he goes to Egypt in 1816, one of the earliest expeditions after Napoleon, he is told by Henry Salt, the British consul in Cairo, that down or up the Nile River at the town of Luxor, on the west bank of Luxor, there is the head of a statue, and it is the most perfect, beautiful head I have ever seen in Egypt. Remember, at this time, most of Egyptian antiquities were looked down upon as not being equal to the Greek and Roman sculptures. They were not seen as a form of fine art. They were monstrous size, they were angular, they were stiff, not flowing and lively and imitative of nature like the Greek and Roman sculpture is. And so most Egyptian art was looked down on in these early years before the Rosetta Stone was cracked and you could finally read the hieroglyphs. But Henry Salt tells Giovanni Belzoni, if you want to go down and try and transport this head to London, there's going to be something in it for you. And Belzoni does it. How do they refer to this head? They're not just going to keep talking about this beautiful head in the ground, which is surprisingly beautiful in contrast to all the other Egyptian monuments. They start to refer to it as the Memnon head. They give it a name. Well, who is Memnon? Memnon, as it turns out, is a character in the Greek literary classics said to be an Ethiopian king who joined the Battle of Troy in the first millennium BC. The idea here is that if we find a work of fine art, something that we admire in otherwise savage and strange Egypt, then it must be connected in some way with the Greek and Roman tradition, because everything that is worthy of our admiration, everything that's good and beautiful in this world, is somehow connected to Western civilization. And Western civilization is defined as the Greeks and Romans, at least at this early date. Eventually, Egypt, ancient Egypt, will be subsumed into that definition of Western civilization as the precursors to the Greeks, but not yet, not in Giovanni Belzoni's time. And so the early name for this head was the Memnon head. One, because they didn't know what the ancient Egyptians called it. But in lieu of that, they said, well, we got to give it a name. How about something that connects it to the Greeks? Because, somehow this has to be connected to the Greeks. We now know that the head is the head of Ramses, one of the most famous pharaohs of ancient Egypt. But you're not going to learn that until the hieroglyphs are cracked in the 1820s. Another example. Heinrich Schliemann, the excavator of Troy in the 1860s and 1870s. Heinrich Schliemann goes to the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean, and he's trying to find a dig, a potential site that will make him famous. And he immediately fixates on the Homeric classics, the Iliad, the Battle of Troy. And he says, this must be historically true, it's not a myth, and I'm going to find the site of Troy itself. Okay, remember, nearly all of the expeditions and excavations that take place in the 19th century take place in the lands of the Ottoman Empire, mostly Muslim. Okay? But pretty much no Western explorer is interested in excavating Muslim artifacts. Okay, they're interested in finding things that are related to their preferred version their preferred pedigree of Western civilization. And that means somehow, if something's worthy of your attention, if you're going to spend money and time to excavate it, it has to be connected somehow to the Greeks or the Romans. A final example, when many archaeologists begin to go to Central Asia and northwestern China, the deserts up there, what we now refer to as the Silk Road oftentimes. These Silk Road archaeologists were drawn to Central Asian art and antiquities once they realized that they contained traces of Greek influence. From Alexander the Great, Alexander the Great's armies conquered Persia, they conquered northwestern India, and even into what we now think of as modern-day Afghanistan. And when the Greek culture of Alexander's armies mixed with the indigenous cultures that were already there, they produced something that art historians now refer to as Gandharan art. Gandharan art is going to be a mix of Indian or various Asian artistic motifs with Greek motifs, and is going to be expressed very often through a Buddhist medium. All right, it's going to be a sculpture of a bodhisattva or the Buddha or something like that. All right, but what these Silk Road archaeologists were admiring was only the Greek aspects of this art. They went all the way to Central Asia and northwestern China, not to look at the Central Asians and the Chinese, but to look at evidence that had survived of Greek influence. One of my favorite lines from the German archaeologist Albert von Lecoq, referring to a sculpture of Gandharan art, he says, quote, "The drapery falls in noble lines, not yet degraded by Eastern Asiatic misunderstanding of classical forms." Misunderstanding of classical forms. They can't understand it because they're inferior to us. But what he admires is the drapery in this sculpture that falls in noble lines, not yet degraded. He's admiring the Greeks and no one else. Now, the biases of Judeo-Christian sympathies. Again, sympathies is the best word, not necessarily belief, because again, these are men of science, and they're very proud. They take a lot of pride in their identity as rational people who don't believe in superstition. All right, now some of them are practicing Christians as well, okay? But many of them I would classify more as, we have a general sympathy towards Judeo-Christian ideas and religion, and we regard them as being uniquely suited to creating civilization, and they played a very large role in Western civilization. But nonetheless, they may not be actual, every Sunday going to church true believers. Okay, so what sort of biases can we see in these Judeo-Christian sympathies? Well, think of the Indiana Jones films. 2 of the 4 films deal with the Old and New Testament. All right, they deal with the history of Judaism and Christianity. Think of the Ark of the Covenant between the Hebrews and God, and then the Holy Grail. All right, a mythic artifact from medieval Christian era. Now, the biases of these Judeo-Christian sympathies can be found in what we refer to as biblical archaeology. Biblical archaeology very often centered on what was, Palestine. Present day, much of it now is Israel. Biblical archaeology was obsessed with Old Testament sites. The Hebrew Bible, not so much the New Testament. There aren't as many monuments. The New Testament is much more about ideas and speeches and whatnot. It's the Old Testament in which you have lots of references to monumental architecture and palaces and things you can actually dig up. And so biblical archaeologists during the 19th and early 20th century were obsessed with finding Old Testament sites and trying to verify and find evidence of the legacy of peoples who were mentioned in the Old Testament. Well, there's a dilemma here, because the lands of the ancient Hebrews are now occupied by mostly Muslim people. Okay? So what they often did is they would study the customs of the peoples of the Muslims who lived in the Bible lands in search of evidence, of traces of peoples and ideas and places mentioned in the Old Testament. That is to say, another way of putting this is that the present-day Muslims of the Middle East were interesting only to the extent that they unwittingly preserved ancient traces of the world of the Bible. Okay, just like with the Greco-Roman sympathies, Western archaeologists had the uncanny ability to cast their gaze out over Muslim lands and see nothing but Greeks, Romans, and Hebrews. Okay? And they would often impose geographic place names that were drawn from the Greco-Roman tradition as well. All right? The lands between the Tigris and the Euphrates were known as Mesopotamia, not Iraq. The term Iraq had existed for like 800 years prior to the archaeologists doing serious biblical archaeology in the 19th century. But Iraq is what the Muslims call it. We're going to call it Mesopotamia, a Greek term meaning between the rivers that we've revived. We're going to use that instead. And then you would see the publication of these cartographic correspondences in which the modern day place names of the Middle East would be overlaid on top of their biblical equivalents. Okay? The present day lands and peoples of the Middle East were interesting only insofar as they could teach you something about the ancient inhabitants. That's a very common theme that you see actually throughout the entire world. We'll study the present day fallen, somewhat barbarian, uncivilized people who live here, but only because we think maybe unwittingly they preserve some traces of the ancient vigor that once animated this land. One of my favorite examples of this was the Palestine Exploration Fund. The Palestine Exploration Fund put out a magazine, a journal, on a regular basis, the quarterly statement, the Palestine Exploration Fund quarterly statement that would summarize all the great work being done in biblical archaeology throughout the Middle East. And you consistently see this single-minded focus on the Hebrew Bible to the exclusion of the Muslims who actually live in these lands in that actual day and age. There's this advertisement in the 1892 issue of the Palestine Quarterly Statement, in which a book about the Islamic history in Palestine is marketed. It's advertised as a novelty product because the advertisement itself admits that, quote, almost nothing had been done on the subject up until now. 1892, 100 years after Napoleon. And this book is being advertised as almost nothing had been done on the subject of the Islamic history of Palestine. All right, think of that. That's a really great example. Now, this Western bias against Islam would be imparted to the next generation of non-Western elites. And we'll talk about this more at length in future episodes, but basically, when the leaders, the intellectual and political leaders of the Middle Eastern states themselves begin to be educated in European universities, set up their own museums, and do their own archaeology, they will absorb the same Western ideas, the same Western biases towards the Greco-Roman tradition and against Islam. And their museums will also privilege the display and collection of Greek and Roman ruins. And it's going to be quite late before any museum in the Middle East even has a display on Islamic artifacts. One of my favorite quotes in 1934, Minister of Education in Iraq, Saadi al-Husri, is pained to hear a foreign visitor to Baghdad express, quote, astonishment upon not finding Arab or Islamic antiquities in the museum of a city that was once the Abbasid capital. 1934. Palestine Exploration Fund quarterly statement advertisement was 1892. 1934, the problem still exists. Iraq, the site of one of the greatest ancient Arab Islamic empires in world history, doesn't have a single artifact relating to that time period because they're still privileging Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian history to the expense of any other. All right, our third theme. Indiana Jones in history promotes Western civilization with a missionary zeal. The West is best, and anything worthy of admiration must be connected to us. We've already made a few allusions to this topic in previous themes. No positive contribution to civilization is ascribed in the films to any non-Western culture. You can also think of the Indiana Jones films as well, to see how some of these biases get replicated in the films. Think about the films in which you have non-Western artifacts. All right, non-Judeo-Christian artifacts. Into the Temple of Doom takes place in India. All the horrors and the dark tone of the Thuggee cult, ripping hearts, the Sankara stones. These are the artifacts. Have only sinister purposes. Nothing good seems to be able to come from them. In the fourth film, down in Latin America, they eventually talk about how the ancient civilization, which was so advanced that Indiana Jones is trying to uncover, it wasn't built by the natives because the natives aren't capable of building something like that. It was because they had contact with aliens, the kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and it was these aliens who came down to Earth and taught the native inhabitants how to build these things. And then once the aliens left, they degenerated and stagnated, and the ruins were forgotten about. Okay? No positive contribution to civilization can be ascribed to any non-Western culture. Okay, and there's several ways to explain this contemporary scorn. Miscegenation, Oriental stagnation and despotism, and savage indifference. I'm not saying this is what we actually believe. This is what the discourse was at the time. This is what the archaeologists said at the time. And so everywhere around the world where these archaeologists went, they would usually come up with an explanation for how great ruins, great monuments of the past could exist outside of the Mediterranean and Western Europe. How is it possible that the people here built this wonderful stuff? Well, the idea was, in one form or another, that there was an ancient migration or a people who came from the Western culture. Sometimes it'll be the Greeks themselves, like Alexander the Great. They actually went there to northwestern India. Or it'll be the Romans. They were part of the Roman Empire. Sometimes it'll be seen in racial terms. The Aryans, the Aryan race would be imagined to have migrated into India. And then they would say, okay, so originally this was a really genius, talented people, and they built these things. And then why did they no longer keep it up? Why did they stagnate and become this pitiful place that we're able to conquer now? Is because they stagnated. They underwent miscegenation. Miscegenation is the mixing with what are imagined to be inferior peoples. All right, the Aryan race, the Greeks or whatever. Remember Gandharan art, not yet degraded by Eastern Asiatic misunderstandings of classical forms. They lost their original Western vigor, Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian vigor, by miscegenation with barbarians, who are almost invariably darker-skinned peoples. And so you'll often see, when archaeologists go to other parts of the world, whether it's Mayan ruins or ruins in India, they'll look at the local population and they'll say, people with lighter skin are the ones who intermixed with inferior savages the least. And therefore, they're probably the ones responsible for the creation. Their ancestors are probably the ones responsible for the creation of these great monuments, because their skin color is the closest to what we imagine the skin color of the ancient Aryan race must have been like. And the archaeologists also had their own tools to try to confirm this, to provide evidence for this theory, that it was whiter-skinned peoples who created everything, because they were the ones who were more closely related to the Greeks and Romans, or the Hebrews, or the Aryans, whatever it might be. It was called anthropometry. Sort of a discredited science today, but very respectable in its own day and age. All the way into the 1930s, as long as the age of Western expeditions continues, you see archaeologists engaging in anthropometry. What is anthropometry? It is the taking of cranial measurements. All right, the eye cavities, the length of the nose, the protrusion of the chin, the size of the head, all this sort of stuff. And it would be said that you could identify the ability or the inability to build or contribute to civilization based on various features of someone's head. And this is one of the more uncomfortable aspects of doing research on this topic. You go to the archives of Western explorers, and I've gone to many archives. Invariably, in almost every single one of them, you see boxes filled with hundreds of scorecards. They're like sports scorecards. in which you'll have a mugshot in several directions, front, side, back, whatever it might be, of some non-Western person, some local person who sat down for a portrait, and then below it are all of their stats, like they're a baseball player. But it isn't, batting average or, admiral type of things that you want to look at and say, ooh, this guy's really impressive. It's the size of their cranium. It's, the position of their ears, all these sorts of things. And then it was imagined that you could document the migration patterns of the superior Aryans and then where they intermixed with inferior peoples. Okay. Next. We, the Western archaeologists, have now rescued and revitalized the ancient, forgotten, wonderful history of foreign lands. In the present day, we've rescued it from undeserving and indifferent native stewards who have undergone stagnation as a result of this miscegenation. Okay? And we're rescuing it from them. They don't deserve this because they don't preserve it, they don't recognize how great it is, and they are so far apart from the ancient ancestors who actually built this stuff. But because we do recognize it, and because we also lay claim to some sort of, genealogical connection with the people who built it, we have every right to remove it and preserve it. Then, the natives are indifferent to it anyway. Sometimes they're actively hostile to it. So of course we have the right to take it away. Okay? Because the locals, for whatever reason, don't appreciate it. Now, the interpretations of why the locals one day in the distant past built something so magnificent and yet now are completely indifferent to it and have allowed it to fall into ruin, they had many different types of explanations. Some of my favorites concern the Mayan ruins in Central America. The Mayan ruins were interpreted in many, many different ways, all of them fairly insulting to the indigenous peoples of the land where the ruins are actually found. They were said, maybe it was the lost tribes of Atlantis, i.e. Greeks, or a lost tribe of the Israelites who crossed the sea and were then, built these monuments and then intermixed with the local savages. And maybe somewhere in the jungles there's a lighter-skinned people who we haven't found yet who are actually responsible for building these ruins. Okay, it was also thought that maybe Aryan migration had occurred over the Bering Land Bridge, or maybe it was the Vikings who came over the Atlantic, and they built these things and then intermixed with the local peoples. But because the locals were such deplorable stewards and could not appreciate the wonderful ruins and artifacts in their midst, even the artifacts themselves wanted to leave and go to a Western museum. The most self-serving and absolutely hilarious quote from any Western expedition comes from Giovanni Belzoni in 1816 when he is transporting or attempting to transport the Memnon head up the Nile River to get it to Cairo and eventually to the British Museum where it sits today. He says, quote, talking about finding the Memnon head in the sand, "I found it near the remains of its body and chair, with its face upwards, and apparently smiling on me at the thought of being taken to England." See, even the Memnon head itself wants to leave Egypt. He wants to go to England, to somewhere where he will be appreciated for the emblem of a great ancient civilization brought low by Oriental stagnation and miscegenation. And eventually the Chinese and Japanese will complicate this worldview because the archaeologists will realize, hey, wait a second, this is a non-Western people that has fairly pale skin and with their own monumental history and script and all these sorts of things. We need a new explanation to understand how the Chinese and Japanese could be somewhat civilized in a way that we don't see anywhere else outside of Europe. And so they would, there were some people who then tried to integrate the Chinese and the Japanese into their theories and say, well, maybe they didn't undergo miscegenation. They didn't intermix with inferior peoples as much, and they too are the ancestors of Aryans. All right, the Nazis actually would explicitly say, not surprisingly, given the fact that they end up allying with the Japanese, that the upper class Asians, the aristocrat Asians, were a form of white Aryans who did not intermix with inferior peoples. Our fourth theme. Indiana Jones in history was a committed and conservative servant of empire. Of course, he promotes Western civilization in general. Of course, every single Western archaeologist would say Western civilization, Greco-Roman tradition, Judeo-Christian legacy, as it was distilled in Europe, is hands down the best in the world. No other civilization can compare. That was supposed to be self-evident. That was obvious in the day. Okay, but after promoting Western civilization in general, he promoted the superiority of his specific empire's take on that civilization. Okay, you think of the example from the films. Indiana Jones glorifies Judeo-Christian civilization generally. Okay, he's going after Hebrew and Christian artifacts. And he has awe and respect for them as emblems of a great civilization that he identifies with in some way. But the American stewardship of these things is seen as better than the German version. Okay, the American should be the rightful stewards of anything that he finds. If it's going to go into a museum, it should be not in a museum, but in my museum, because we're better than the Germans. Although the historical Indiana Jones probably would have conceded that the Germans were still better than any other non-Western people. Okay? The French sinologist Paul Pelliot, who does an expedition along the Silk Road from 1906 to 1908, says upon realizing that his British rivals along the Silk Road are trying to hinder the French expedition in favor of their own British expedition, he says, quote, "I fear that even in scientific matters it is necessary to speak of rivals." He's very disappointed to learn this, because he's been weaned on the ideology that it's all about politically disinterested service to science and science alone for the betterment of civilization and humankind. And then actually on the expedition trail, he realizes, wait a second, it's not just about science. We're all rivals still. Within the Western countries, we're all competing with one another. And we all think that our distillation of Western civilization is the best. Each archaeologist was a committed believer in the benevolence of their empire. And they actively resisted reform or change. Okay? As a result, the collection and display of artifacts was a referendum on the greatness and vitality of your empire and its stewardship of all the great civilizations of antiquity. Whoever can be the best steward of all the great civilizations of antiquity can claim the mantle of best civilization, best empire today. We are the most deserving of being considered the cream of the Western crop today. In 1835, a French collector reveals this interplay of civilization and specific empire, in this case French Empire, when he said of the French efforts in Egypt during the Napoleonic era, he says, quote, "France, snatching an obelisk from the ever-heightening mud of the Nile, or the savage ignorance of the Turks, earns a right to the thanks of the learned of Europe, to whom belong all the monuments of antiquity, because they alone know how to appreciate them. Antiquity is a garden that belongs by natural right to those who cultivate and harvest its fruits. All right, so you see both elements here. He's saying that the learned of Europe naturally own all the monuments of antiquity because we alone know how to appreciate them. He's talking about all of Europe here, all of the Westerners. But within the Westerners, he says France specifically, by preserving so many objects from ancient Egypt, earns a right to the thanks of the learned people of Europe. Because we are fulfilling the mission, this noble mission of science, education, and preservation better than any other Western people. And because we're the best, the status quo should persist. Okay? Most archaeologists were committed, conservative defenders of their empires. Aurel Stein, a Hungarian by birth, but eventually becomes a naturalized British citizen and serves in India. The British Raj, colonial domains in India. He's the guy, again, that I study the most. You read his papers, and it's filled with references, very pejorative references to the inability of the Indian people to rule themselves, their incapacity for self-government. He calls Gandhi an ass, or his friend calls Gandhi an ass, and he agrees with him. Let's be accurate here. He has this one letter where he's talking about how he should propose an experiment. If the Indians really want to rule themselves and think they can do it without the British, all the British civil servants should go on leave at the exact same time, take 6 months leave, vacation, and let the Indians try to rule their country by themselves. And he says within a few weeks they'd be begging for the return of the Europeans because they can't rule themselves. All right. Pretty much every single archaeologist believed that whatever empire they served was the best empire and that it was a force for good throughout the world, and especially in their colonial domains. Another way of putting this is to observe that the historical Indiana Jones was on the right end of the political spectrum. He was right-wing. He was not left-wing. Okay, he was a Republican, to put it another way. All right, Sven Hedin, the Swedish explorer Sven Hedin, who again does a lot of expeditions on the Silk Road, was a fervent supporter of Hitler. And pretty much every explorer and archaeologist was very hostile to socialism and anything that threatened class divisions or race divisions. So the idea that Indiana Jones would be so hostile to the Nazis is a bit misleading. In history, he would only be hostile to the Nazis as the rivals of an American empire in trying to represent the apex of Western civilization. But he likely would have agreed with much of Nazi ideology. Distressingly so. Okay? Almost every archaeologist would have wholeheartedly agreed with the whole package of Nazi racial theories. Okay, those were not Nazi innovations. It was widely shared. The same ideological impetus behind anthropometry, the taking of measurements of these people and whatnot, it finds its echo in Nazi racial theories. Okay, so all the archaeologists, think of them as conservative, privileged agents and servants of their empires, and they had a vested interest in making sure that that privilege continued. Our fifth theme, the fervent invocation of abstract, lofty ideals. Okay, when Indiana Jones speaks, he's always talking about abstract, lofty ideals that you can't really touch. These ideals justify the removal of artifacts and separate him from the lower classes, who actually engage in the same physical act of removal of artifacts that he does, but they are delegitimized, and he is legitimized by the invocation of lofty abstract ideals. The most famous line from the Indiana Jones films, that belongs in a museum. Much more on this in our second talk, which is, why does that belong in a museum? For now, we need only note that the Enlightenment ideals of science, preservation, and education were embodied in the institution of the modern museum, which is itself the embodiment of the loftiest of the abstract ideals of the Enlightenment. Science, preservation, and education. The museum justifies and enables the removal of all artifacts until the natives build their own museums. Talk about that in our fourth talk. Okay. Now, these abstract ideals of scientific altruism obscure class tensions. Just like they obscure the racial division, they also obscure class tensions back home. Only the literate Western hero speaks in the historical record. Oftentimes, in any given expedition or excavation, it's the Western leader of the expedition is the only person who's literate. The only person who can actually read and write, and all the records of that expedition are left by him. And he speaks both on behalf of and down to the men that he employs. He might employ, 20, 30, 100 men on any given dig. Right? Locals. And he'll speak on behalf of them as if he knows what they're thinking. One of my favorite examples is when Oral Stein uses the royal we to impart his own emotions to his men. All right, in his first expedition to the Silk Road in 1901, Oral Stein, who remember is a civil servant in the British Raj, all right, he's a member of the colonial ruling class in India, and on his expedition he brings with him several Indian servants from the military who are tasked with making maps. And in 1901, Queen Victoria, who was also Empress of India, dies, and he receives news of her death while on the expedition trail. And he says, quote, "I could see that my 2 Indian followers, to whom I communicated the news, understood, and in their own way shared the deep emotion which filled me." Now, did they? We have no way to verify Stein's claim here. It seems sort of unlikely, most likely, that Stein is, close to tears and thinking about the death of Queen Victoria, and that his Indian servants as well. Maybe they did. I don't want to be the arrogant historian who says we know what you're thinking. I don't know what they're thinking. But let's be honest, Stein doesn't know what they're thinking either. But he speaks on behalf of his men. And so very often, we have no idea what the rest of the men in any given excavation actually think, because the historical Indiana Jones speaks for them. Now, this rhetorical monopoly was perpetuated in all narratives of expeditions that were presented for public consumption, often in very pejorative fashion. Dr. Jones is a legitimate scholar because he has these lofty abstract ideals about the museum, about public education, about science. Everyone else is a mercenary treasure seeker. Treasure seeker or tomb raider were the terms that were deployed. I'm a scientist, I'm a scholar. You are a treasure seeker or a tomb raider. And even the verbs that were used to describe what the natives or locals did were pejorative. They were said to burrow in like they're an animal, whereas we have, carefully regulated digs. You have to think about this, though. The laborers, or the treasure seekers, the local treasure seekers, are engaging in the exact same physical act. They're both digging up artifacts, objects, and trying to turn them into artifacts by selling them to someone else. Okay? But because the educated Western elite gives it to a museum or sells it to a museum, his enterprise is labeled as legitimate. And everyone else is illegitimate because they don't have the access to the museum. And then they are denigrated in the public narratives that come down to us. Now, this is the public appearance. If you actually do research and look at unpublished writings, diaries, and letters and whatnot that these archaeologists wrote, it becomes much more fascinating. You actually find that men like Aurel Stein will criticize other Western archaeologists as not being men of science. I have this wonderful example in which Aurel Stein sees the German archaeologist Albert von Lecoq along the Silk Road, and he visits a site that they had excavated on, and he is stunned at how messy and destructive their methods were, with no regard for scientific thoroughness or preservation. And he says they came in here like robbers, just, a bull in a china shop, coming to take what they wanted and then left. And he actually says this is not science, this is robbery. Now, he's never going to publish that in the public sphere. But behind the scenes, you can see that he makes a distinction between a true man of science like himself and the German archaeologist who he's like, oh my God, they're horrible. They're no better than the natives in his eyes. At one point in Stein's diary, one of his Indian servants, Stein writes in his diary, again, he would never publish this. He says that Ram Singh, the name of his Indian servant, is tired. He complains of, quote, work done for others' credit. That's one of the first times I've ever seen a glimpse into a non-Western servant or laborer hired by the Western expedition leader, and their voice is being replicated, and you're realizing that they're unhappy. They're saying, I do all this work on this expedition, and you, Mr. Stein, are the only one who gets any credit whatsoever. Okay, you rarely see that, and never in the published accounts. But in the private, unpublished accounts, you can see some of this stuff. Okay, you also have to recognize that many of the laborers and people who work on these expeditions usually wouldn't speak publicly about their grievances, even if they had very legitimate grievances. Remember, they're poor employees who need their jobs. And the compensation of getting good wages for unskilled labor was often more than enough to offset any grievances that they may have had. Okay, sometimes I think about an analogy to sexual harassment in the workplace and whatnot, and this idea, why do women so often not report something that is, we now recognize as a legitimate grievance? Well, you need your job. And if you're afraid that, resisting the harassment or ill treatment that you're receiving, if you're afraid that that might lose your job and lose your access to wages, maybe you won't report it. You'll just put up with it. The same goes for anyone who is in a marginalized, tenuous position of employment. And that's certainly the case for the impoverished laborers who are being hired to work on Western expeditions. Some scholars actually want to replace terms like treasure seekers or tomb raiders with subsistence digger as sort of an ideologically neutral term to describe the non-Western people who actually go out and try and find these things and sell them, to recognize that they're doing so for the sake of subsistence. They're poor. They need money. They're trying to survive. And so, a subsistence digger is, I don't know if it's more polite, but at least it's not as pejorative a term as something like treasure seeker is. Treasure seeker is designed to say, I have lofty ideals and therefore what I do is legitimate. He doesn't have abstract lofty ideals and therefore whatever he does is illegitimate. Our sixth theme, the mutually beneficial patronage of a rich man. The archaeologist was a scholar for hire whose services advanced the social, diplomatic, or political agenda of a wealthy and powerful man. Okay, collecting antiquities or sponsoring an archaeological expedition are very expensive luxury enterprises, and not everyone can afford it. The scholar himself certainly cannot afford it. I think of one expedition that I've done a lot of research on, Orlstein's expedition to the Silk Road in 1930. $100,000 was raised for all the expenses. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money today. But this is almost 100 years ago. Okay? Expeditions are expensive. And the Indiana Jones in history cannot afford it. But he can work as the middleman for those who can. This brings us to the 1%, the rich and powerful of our society. All right? The money's going to come from them in one form or another. It usually doesn't come directly from the government. It comes from private sources of funding. All right? But the rich and powerful don't waste their money. They expect a return on their investment. What is their return? Various forms of intangible capital. Things that mere money alone cannot buy, because anything they can buy, they've already bought. The only things they can't buy are a reputation as a philanthropist, a cultural connoisseur, an enlightened politician. Okay? They want a reputation. They want a benevolent reputation in the public eye. That's something that you can't buy. You can't just go to the store and buy that. You have to get it a different way. You have to get it by positioning yourself as the financier, the supporter, the patron of worthy scientific enterprises that contribute to a mission of public education and improve the world that we live in. I like to think of this as a form of money laundering. Okay? The rich and powerful, powerful politicians, rich tycoons, the robber barons, that's an apt word, the robber baron. How do you think they became the baron? By robbery, by engaging in dubious practices. No one gets to the top and becomes a member of the 1% without cracking a few heads on the way to the top. You got to do a lot of things that you aren't that proud of having done. The competition is fierce. Okay, but when you get to the top, you're now a very public person. Everyone knows who you are. And you want them to regard you in a good way. So how do you cultivate a benevolent reputation? Well, you can say, I'm not just a robber baron. I'm a philanthropist. I give my money to worthy causes that are intended to help you eventually. Or I'm a cultural connoisseur. Maybe I came into money very quickly, and people who have had money in their families for many generations look down upon me because they see me as new money, crude new money, unable to appreciate the fine things in life that comes with many generations of being acclimated to them. Or maybe you're a politician, and you got to the top, but again, you had to kill a few people to get there. And now you want to be seen as a benevolent politician. Well, you can finance an archaeological expedition. Now, these forms of capital come in the social capital, diplomatic capital, political capital. Give you a few examples of famous patrons in search of these forms of capital. Politicians. When Orlstein wants to do an expedition to Central Asia, to the ancient Silk Road, He goes to the government of India, and he has a hard time finding anyone who's willing to finance his expedition. He needs money. He can't afford it. He can't do an expedition on his own. He has to find a rich man to back him. And it's only when he has a chance meeting with Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India, who visits the museum that Stein is curating in Lahore, in northwestern India, that he's finally able to talk to Lord Curzon and tell him all about his plans and what he wants to do. And Lord Curzon realizes that if I find the money, if I find this diplomatic support to send Stein on this expedition, I will position myself as a supporter of science. And also he's interested in getting British influence in northwestern China, an extension of India. And so he says, yeah, I'm going to support Stein because it's in my interest. I'll be a man of science. I'm an enlightened politician. Okay? And he greenlights the expedition, and that's how Stein gets started. Heinrich Schliemann is someone who makes a buttload of money in the middle part of the 19th century during the California Gold Rush and then the Crimean War. But he came from very poor, disadvantaged origins. So Heinrich Schliemann is trying to, he's got a lot of money, but he's what old money refers to as new money. You're crude. You don't have a proper education. You haven't been around wealth and privilege and fine art your entire life. You don't know how to properly appreciate it. So how is he going to cultivate respectability among the old money elites? Because they look down on new money. Well, he's gonna do an archaeological expedition. He's gonna find the fabled city of Troy, the Greeks. And he thinks by doing that, he'll gain respectability among the 1%. He won't be a new money tycoon anymore, a crude new money tycoon. He will have laundered his wealth into cultural and social respectability. Sometimes you just have bored, idle gentlemen looking for something to do. The Earl of Carnarvon. The Earl of Carnarvon is the man who will give all the money for Howard Carter's excavations in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, eventually resulting in the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun. The Earl of Carnarvon is also famous as the owner of Downton Abbey, i.e. Highclere Castle. Okay, Lord Carnarvon actually starts out not with Howard Carter. In the first decade of the 20th century, he's trying to dig on his own. He actually applies for a permit from the Egyptian Antiquities Service, and he starts digging on his own. He's traveled to Egypt many times, and he says, hey, I think I could do that. I could, dig and find antiquities. No, you can't. You're wrong, Lord Carnarvon. And the Antiquities Service looks at what he's doing and say, oh my God, he's destroying everything. He doesn't have a clue what he's doing. He needs a scholar to help him out. So they recommend Howard Carter to manage his digs in Egypt for him. But Lord Carnarvon is trying sort of like Heinrich Schliemann, although Carnarvon has, he's a landed, wealthy elite. He doesn't have as much of an anxiety about his cultural status as Schliemann does, obviously. He still wants to be seen not just as a rich, idle gentleman, but as a scholar. And so he keeps on trying to finance all these digs in Egypt, and eventually finances the dig that leads to the discovery of King Tut. And then you have the tycoons, either the robber barons themselves or the descendants of the robber barons. John D. Rockefeller Jr. in the 1920s and 1930s will finance, most of the excavations and digs of James Henry Breasted. James Henry Breasted was one of the most famous American Egyptologists, active in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. He does digs all over the Middle East. And a lot of his money will come from John D. Rockefeller. What is Rockefeller getting out of this? A reputation as a philanthropist who contributes to worthy causes, not just as someone who benefited from, making $1 billion and exploiting his workers and taking advantage of, a certain place and time in which money was easy to come by and killing all of his rivals on the way to the top. Now he's an enlightened philanthropist. In short, archaeological expeditions combine the resources, knowledge, and skills of the 1% with the aspiring professionals of the upper middle class in a cultural enterprise that was beneficial to the careers and reputations of both men. Now, what sort of skills did these aspiring professionals possess? Leads us to our 7th theme, the technical training that was alien to the 1%. Most archaeologists, most Indiana Joneses in history had a background in the military and expertise in what we now refer to as area studies, knowledge, and technical skills. Some idle gentlemen, some rich men will have some of these, but few will combine all of them like the field scholars do. Okay, let's start with military skills. Not how to use a bullwhip. Okay, military skills. Many of the archaeologists will have specific training as military engineers. You think of the Corps of Army Engineers responsible for so many public projects in America in the 20th century. Military is not all just about shooting guns and, battlefield strategy and whatnot. There's many other components involved and well. When we talk about Pompeii, we'll talk about Karl Weber and Roque Joaquin de Alcubierre, the first two men to oversee the excavations at Pompeii. Both of them, their background is in military engineering. That is the ability to dig a big hole underground that won't collapse when you walk into that hole. That's very important in archaeology. And these are skills that they learn in the military, building fortifications. Okay, mining for minerals. And it says, quote, talking about Alcubierre and Weber overseeing the excavations of Pompeii. One of their colleagues says, quote, he professes military architecture. And if His Majesty chose him to direct these excavations, he chose him because he knows how to operate an underground excavation in a safe manner, and he knows how to make plans of the buildings he would encounter there. Okay, the rich gentlemen don't have these sorts of skills. All right, they usually didn't learn them. They didn't need to. All right, but the archaeologists know how to make maps, they know how to make blueprints, and they know how to dig holes in the ground. They also have the ability to lead and discipline men. You're going to be a leader of men on an expedition. It's never just you. It's actually, you have quite a large entourage. As maybe the minimum of people you're going to have around you at any time is between 5 and 10. You may have over 100 people, and you are in charge of everything. You need to have experience with large groups of people and have a leadership position. Okay, and when things get out of line, not to your liking, you have to be able to impose discipline and keep order among your men. It can't get out of control, or else it'll be anarchy and the dig will fail. Again, one of my favorite examples from the diaries of Oral Stein, who I study the most. He says, quote, on December 14th, 1906, had to hurry on Ram Singh, this is his Indian servant that they have so many problems with, who was taking his meal at 8 a.m., declaring he could not get up earlier. Insolent attitude and outburst on account of my remonstrating. Attempts to leave by asking the camelmen to unload. Stopped this barefaced insubordination. These are the terms he uses. Insolent. Insubordination. These are the words of an officer who has been challenged by an enlisted man. Even more galling to Stein was the fact that his Indian subordinate had further, quote, presumed to state his opinion about me personally. Does a private state his personal opinion about the officer, his drill sergeant? No! The next day, after Ram Singh had, quote, come to better sense and apologized, Stein nonetheless insisted on, quote, a written reply to my memorandum calling for explanations. This was military discipline, and Ram Singh was lucky to get off so lightly. Hassan Akhund, his camel factotum, was once sentenced by Stein to a public whipping for his part in a brawl. The resulting welts on his body, Stein informs us, quote, had a very salutary effect upon the young offender. Okay. In Indiana Jones, we don't actually ever get to see this because his rivals, the people who betray him, tend to die. So we actually don't get to see what his revenge would be when he is betrayed by someone from a lower class. One of the people that he employs. Think of the opening scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Satipo, the guy who he goes into the cave where the golden idol is. And he sort of wipes the tarantulas off his back and whatnot. And then when they're trying to escape from the temple, there's a pit. And Indiana Jones says, throw me the whip, throw me the whip. And he says, only if you give me the idol. And then once he gives him the idol, he throws the whip away and doesn't let him get past. And when Indiana Jones, the hero that he is, eventually overcomes the problem anyways and finds Satipo, he's been killed by one of the traps. If Satipo had not been killed, and they both got out of there okay. If the films wanted to be historically accurate, very likely Satipo would have been whipped afterwards, like Hassan Akhund, the camel factotum for Oral Stein, was whipped. What about those area study skills? Foreign and ancient dead languages, knowledge of foreign customs, immersion in history, problem-solving abilities. Indiana Jones is able to solve the traps in a temple. He knows where all the traps are going to be. They have extensive travel experience. They have wilderness survival skills, cartography abilities, geography, geology, the composition of soils. They're proficient in firearms. Okay, it's not literary license when Indiana Jones takes out his gun and starts shooting places up. Well, it's a little bit of literary license, but nonetheless, the fact that he would have a gun and that he would be willing to use it on the expedition trail is absolutely historical fact. Every single archaeologist takes guns into the field, and they were willing to use them if they had to. In short, archaeologists knew how to get around the world safely on their own, lead a team of men, and return home with tales to tell and ancient artifacts to illustrate it. Our last theme, espionage. First passive espionage and then aggressive espionage. This unique combination, very often that you see, of some sort of military background with area studies proficiency, humanities proficiency in languages and customs and this sort of thing, means that archaeologists are uniquely positioned to engage in espionage. Now in the films, you actually see a little bit of this in both the first film and the fourth film. There are echoes that Indiana Jones has worked or cooperated with Army intelligence in one form or another. All right, in the first film, Army intelligence approaches him and asks for his expertise, and he gives his expertise in, talking about the Ark, and that's an accurate reflection that often occurred in the historical record. Intelligence officers, intelligence agencies, usually the military of any given Western empire, would often approach their archaeologist and say, when you go on your expedition, it'd be great if you could take some maps, notes of the local peoples, and all these sort of things, and then give them back to us. And we'll keep them in our files in case we ever have to invade that land, or in case we ever have a use for that sort of information. And in the fourth film, we learned that during the Cold War, he actively served as a spy. As we'll see, there's actually a little bit of truth to some of this. Okay, in real life, archaeologists had a similar association with the armed forces. Prior to World War I in so many ways, as you'll see during this podcast series, is a turning point. All right, with espionage as well. Prior to World War I, 1914, the archaeologists routinely thought of themselves as filling in the blanks, white spaces on maps. And then when they got home, they routinely turned those maps over to their home governments. And they saw no contradiction with the ideals of science. Because to them, to further the interest of their own empire was to further the interest of humankind at large. Because what's best for us is naturally best for the rest of the world. Because our motives are purest, our science is best. And therefore, when we succeed, eventually, by trickle-down effect, the rest of the world will succeed as well. Now, their non-Western native hosts saw it very differently. In fact, as we'll learn, the only consistently raised objections by non-Westerners towards Western archaeologists was not towards the removal of artifacts and antiquities, but rather towards their mapping activities and the survey of military fortifications. Over and over again, this is what you see. And when we get to Who Confronted Indiana Jones, we'll talk about that in greater detail. But that is the only consistent source of opposition that you see throughout from 1798 to 1936. If they think that the archaeologist is surveying our land, mapping our military fortifications, this is information that could potentially be used for military purposes in the future, they will obstruct it. No matter the day and age. After World War I, after 1914, we begin to see archaeologists used no longer for passive intelligence operations. As long as you're there already, take some notes and then turn them over. Now they're going to be actively approached, just like in the Indiana Jones film, actively approached for aggressive espionage activities by Western governments. And they'll become actual espionage agents. They'll become spies. One book that you can read is called The Archaeologist Was a Spy. Couldn't be any clearer there. It talks about how in the United States during World War I, the Office of Naval Intelligence recruited hundreds of scholars as spies to serve around the world. American paleontologist Roy Chapman Andrews, who had done a lot of work in northern China and Mongolia. He's ONI agent number 241. He's sent to China on the pretext of, quote, comparative zoological studies of Chinese mammals. You think that's actually what he did when he got there? Hell no. He collected intelligence on the movement of troops, railway lines, Russian Civil War combatants, all that kind of stuff. He didn't look at comparative zoological studies of Chinese mammals. That's bullshit. In Central America, Mayan archaeologist Sylvanus Morley needed no special pretext beyond archaeology. He just went as an archaeologist to scout out potential U-boat sites, U-boat bases, German submarines. They were afraid during World War I that the Germans, now that they were hostile with America, might try to get a base somewhere close to America within striking distance so they could shoot down American ships in the Gulf of Mexico, perhaps. So what better way to find out if this is actually a threat or not? Let's find a Mayan archaeologist who has a ready-made pretext to go to Central America with no suspicion whatsoever, and we'll task him with the covert operation of trying to go along the coast and see whether or not the Germans have any bases for their U-boats. And so he does. He travels for 2 years along the coast, the Atlantic coast of Central America. And he finds no evidence whatsoever that the Germans are building U-boats. So instead, he turns to the persecution of German expatriate citizens who are living in Central America. And he tries to get them fired from their jobs, especially if they work in an American banana firm. And then after that, he tries to track down U.S. draft dodgers and reports their names back to the U.S. Army back home so they can be persecuted as well. All these scholars who served willingly, they served enthusiastically, as spies during World War I, will be criticized after the war by anthropologist Franz Boas, a very famous anthropologist, seen as the father of the discipline of anthropology in academia. After the war, Franz Boas will say, quote, "These men prostituted science in an unpardonable way and forfeited the right to be classed as a scientist." Now, Boas was roundly condemned for making these statements. His professional association, his professional archaeological association, excommunicated him from the association. He had to give up his membership. But eventually, Boas will win the day. It's during World War II when scholars once again prove willing to serve as spies for the government. During World War II, you'll start to see the beginnings of what I refer to as an institutional divorce between the intelligence agencies and university scholars like Indiana Jones. Okay, during the war, you'll start to see the Western government say we can't really rely on sort of freelance scholars anymore. And many scholars will begin to say, this erodes my reputation of politically disinterested practice of science as well. And that's when you see the creation of the CIA. The CIA will, its origins, its institutional forebears occur during World War II. And once you have the CIA, you basically will have an in-house intelligence agency that trains its own spies and gives them the military intelligence and area studies tools to be able to carry out intelligence work on their own without the aid of archaeologists or any sort of university scholars. And you'll see the path diverge between the two at that point. You either have to go into intelligence work or you have to go into scholarly work. But you can't do both anymore. Okay, this is what I refer to as an institutional divorce between intelligence agencies and archaeologists during World War II. Okay, there was, however, no such divorce with the institution of the museum. From start to finish, the museum is the ultimate enabler of all archaeological expeditions. Without the museum, Indiana Jones in history is nothing but a Tomb Raider. And so we turn now in our next episode to the history of that museum. Episode 2, why does that belong in a museum?